Oh, yeah, sorry, it's been recorded. I always forget. Thanks.
Sorry.
So, Professor Katherine Holt is a lecturer in physical chemistry here at UCL. She obtained a master's and PhD at the University of Oxford, and she was also the Director of Studies for 4 years at UCL and was my boss. Her research now is focused on different aspects of electrochemical and spatial science, and her talk today is Diamonds, More Than Just a Girl's Best Friend. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, let me check that I've got the right screen to share. I think it's that one. Yep, and I've got captions on. I'm going to try not to look at them because they're very distracting because they're incorrect, but
yeah, it's showing fine.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. It's a pleasure to be here. So I've given this talk in a variety of different ways for different audiences. And this is kind of based on a talk that I often give to the UCL Science Club, which runs on Friday evenings throughout term, and it's usually open to A-level students from around London. So they kind of come in on Fridays, and they're very, very keen students who will come in on Friday evenings to listen to talks about science. So it's kind of pitched initially at the level of like a 17-year-old. And I haven't changed that much of it, apart from I've added in a few more kind of recent research questions to kind of show why I in particular am interested. So if some of it's pitched a bit kind of like, you're like, yeah, obviously, it's because that's the level that I usually kind of pitch it at, but hopefully you'll get something from the presentation. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through various different types of diamonds and the different forms that diamond can take, some of which I'm an expert in, some of which I've just included because I think they're interesting and fun. You'll probably be able to tell when you ask me questions afterwards which ones I kind of know about and which ones I'm kind of slightly fudging a little bit. Okay, so talking about, how do I move on? Here we are. So tomorrow, I already mentioned Marilyn Monroe, so I've kind of put this picture in to start. So everybody knows about diamond or thinks they know about diamond. So diamond has this image of being kind of very glamorous and a very special material. And these days we kind of think of it in terms of gemstones, so jewelry, wealth, that kind of thing. But the history of diamond goes back a really long way, millennia, since it was first reported as kind of discovered in India, I think many thousands of years ago. And people have always been really attracted to it as a stone because of the properties it has. So it has some unusual properties. So if you hold it, it's cold to the touch, unlike other stones. It has really interesting optical properties. So even when it's not cut, the way that you can see that it's cut in jewelry, it still is strangely transparent compared to many other stones. And it's also really hard to destroy. So you can throw it in a fire and nothing much happens. You can try and destroy it with acids. It's not you can't corrode it. So people always kind of imbued it with some kind of magical or mystical properties. It was always very related to wealth and intrigue and war and magic and all of those kind of things. But in reality, the properties of diamond have nothing to do with magic, as you well know as chemists. It's all to do with its chemical structure. So this is something that you already know, right? So diamond is an allotrope of carbon. It's one of the forms that carbon can take as a solid. And as I've shown in this image, I hope you can see my cursor here, I have a carbon atom and it's bonded to 4 other carbon atoms in this tetrahedral type arrangement. So you can see that this arrangement enables us to have this kind of long distance kind of crystal structure where every carbon is bonded to 4 other carbons, which in turn are bonded to 4 other carbons, etc. And it takes this structure because carbon can form 4 bonds to use up its valence electrons, as you know. And one of the lowest energy arrangements for it to do that would be that it would share all of the electrons kind of equally with its neighboring carbons. And that's because each of these bonds is kind of like an electron cloud. They all space themselves out equally as far apart as they can get because they're repelling each other, and they form this kind of tetrahedral structure. And the important thing about diamond is that all of the electrons are taken up in bonding. So each of these has 2 electrons in. So this gives rise to the properties that it has, both the structure and the fact that all of the electrons have been used up in bonding. So it's not very reactive, it's hard to oxidize and reduce. It doesn't conduct electricity, all of the electrons are kind of used up. And as we'll see in a moment, the optical properties and actually also the heat properties can be related to its structure as well. So let's talk about how you might find diamond. Why does diamond actually exist? So as I said, there are 2 main allotropes of carbon, graphite and diamonds. Though of course there are many exotic forms of carbon now, like nanotubes, buckyballs, all of these kind of things. But this is a simple phase diagram which is to kind of showing the main forms of carbon. So on the x-axis here I have a temperature going from a low temperature to a high temperature. On this axis is pressure going from low pressure to a very high pressure. And so you can see that if you want to make diamonds, what you need to do is you need to be in this high temperature, high pressure regime up here. So there's various different ways you could make diamonds and different routes to it. So you could start off with vapor, you could start off with carbon in the gas phase, and you could then apply some kind of pressure, so squash it together. And as it comes together, the atoms will start to interact with each other, and they'll form a kind of condensed mass, which would be the liquid. And then as you push it even further together, compress it even further, apply more pressure, then you'll get diamonds. So that's kind of one route to it. Or you could kind of start down here with graphite, which is the other solid form of carbon, and then you could apply pressure to that and it would form diamonds. So there's various routes depending on kind of what you start with, what temperature you start with, what pressure you start with. But you know, high temperatures and high pressures are kind of the answer. So that's why if you want to find diamond naturally in the environment, in our Earth, you usually have to dig for it. It's formed deep under the Earth's core in the mantle, where the temperatures and the pressures are really very high. And the regions of the Earth where you find it are regions where there's been some kind of fault or seismic activity in the Earth's core that has kind of brought stuff up from underneath the core closer to the Earth's surface. And hence diamond mines are found in various particular parts of the world. So this picture here, where it shows this enormous mine, which kind of you can kind of see it's like nearly a mile across, and then there's like this town in the background that you can see. So this is in Russia, but also you find diamonds quite commonly in Canada. There's a big mining place, and various places in Africa you'll have heard of, in particular South Africa and other African nations. And when you dig these stones out of the ground, of course, they're not the beautiful cut gemstones that, you know, Marilyn Monroe was wearing there, but they do have a certain property about them where you can kind of see that they're slightly special stones. So you can see the crystal facets already with some of these uncut stones. And when they come out of the ground, they're kind of in 2 different categories. So there's ones which are of high enough quality to then be later gone on to cut to make gemstones, as kind of shown in the jewel here. And these would tend to be stones which are big enough, first of all, and also that don't have flaws in them. So flaws could either make it that they can't be cut, that they would break when they're cut, or that the optical properties are not great because of the flaws in them. And usually the color is really important as well. So if you look at the stones on the outside, these diamonds on the outside, they are that beautiful transparency that you would expect from diamond. But a bunch of the stones that you dig out, which are still diamonds, are more likely to be of this type of form. And this is diamond that is used in industrial applications, so usually in machining and cutting type applications. And these are stones that are too small, first of all, to be gemstones, or have defects in them, which means that the optical properties aren't going to be great, or a slightly kind of dirty yellowy pinky color. And this I'm going to explain in a moment. So why are some of these diamonds colored? So I kind of said The industrial ones tend to be this kind of dirty kind of color, and even the gemstone that I showed on the previous slide was the middle stone was yellow. So let's talk about why, and it's useful to think first of all, why are things colored? So if I have an object, any old object, obviously white light from the sun is going to shine upon that object, and that object may absorb some of that light. So let's say it absorbs the red and the orange light, and then the rest of the light is reflected, it's not absorbed, and that's what you see. So if it absorbs the red and orange light, you will see a blue object. So why is that? Well, you all pretty much know this, that this is because when the light is absorbed, it's absorbed so that an electron can be excited from its ground state, its lower level state, up to a higher level state, and the wavelength of the light, the energy of the light that's absorbed, corresponds to this energy gap here. So that's kind of what's going on. So if we think about diamonds, if you have defect-free diamond, it doesn't absorb any light. So all of the different wavelengths of the white light just go straight through. It's transparent. And that's because the electrons in diamond are not excited by visible light. We've already talked about the structure here. So we've talked about the fact that all of the electrons are taken up in bonding. It's actually quite difficult to excite these electrons. And in fact, to do it, you would need UV light. So a very simple molecular orbital diagram for diamond would be, if I've got energy going up here, that I would have a valence band, which is where it's the bonding orbitals, basically where the electrons are. And then the next energy level up, which is going to be empty, is the conduction band, and this is the kind of anti-bonding orbitals. And the energy gap between them is actually 5.5 electron volts. And so to excite from this level to this level is going to need UV light, not visible light, and hence that means that diamond generally is not coloured. However, I've said, well, right, you get that coloured kind of industrial diamond, and here I've shown a beautiful example of a yellow diamond. So how was that come about? Well, that's because a very obvious natural impurity for diamond is nitrogen. And that is because, well, there's a lot of nitrogen around, right? And nitrogen is right next to carbon in the periodic table, so it's a similar size. So you can kind of see how easily it would substitute into some of the carbon sites in the diamond. And it can do so without really disrupting the structure too much because it's a similar size. But of course, it has this extra electron, if you look at its electron configuration. And what this does is it introduces an extra energy level into the energy level diagram. So if I have nitrogen in the structure, you start to get this energy level here, and the kind of the width of this will depend on how much nitrogen is there. And it's kind of here in the band gap, and it's got electrons in it. And it turns out you can excite electrons from this impurity band level into these empty energy levels. And this energy gap here is consistent with visible light, with blue or green, which means that you're left over kind of seeing yellow if you've got nitrogen in there. And that's the reason why the industrial diamond stones are often this kind of yellowy color, because nitrogen is like a very common impurity in the diamond structure. Now, you can also get blue diamonds, which are far rarer than the yellow ones. They're very expensive as a consequence. And this is because these diamonds are doped with boron. And again, boron is right next to carbon in the periodic table, so it can just substitute into the structure without interrupting the structure too much. But boron has one less electron than carbon. And what this does is that instead of introducing extra electrons, it introduces an extra empty energy level just above the valence band. So you get this empty level here. And this means that you can use visible light to excite electrons from the valence band into this empty level. And you just need the wavelengths, which are red, yellow, green, to do that excitation. So what you're left over is blue, and that's kind of what you see. So that's kind of natural diamonds. Now, this talk is kind of going to talk about other forms of diamond, and in particular, kind of how can we make diamonds, and then how can we use diamonds. So the first thing is, if we wanted to make diamond ourselves, let's copy nature. Okay, so let's decide to do things the way that the nature does, and we would use high temperature, high pressure conditions, the same as, you know, when diamond is forged in the earth. So high temperature, high pressure synthesis has quite a long history now. It was first developed in the 1950s, I think, though people had tried for a very, very long time beforehand. And what you can do is you can take a carbon source. It's best to use something pretty pure, like graphite, and you put it into some kind of high pressure chamber at very high temperatures and very high pressures. Or, which was a bit of a breakthrough, and what people do now, is you use a metal catalyst, in which case you can use lower temperatures. And what the metal catalyst does is it kind of, as it heats, it's like a liquid, and it can almost like dissolve the carbon atoms which are in the graphite, and then they can kind of float around, and then they form the diamond. So it kind of produces a medium to kind of catalyze this transformation. And you can grow quite big diamonds doing this. How big a diamond you grow is, I think, proportional to how long you do it for. And you can get fairly good gemstone quality diamonds out of this. And in actual fact, one of the advantages really of growing diamonds synthetically is that you can deliberately introduce color to them. So you can deliberately dope them or introduce defects in other ways which give rise to different colors that you can control. But actually, if you look at the numbers, so about 120 million carats of natural diamonds are kind of produced or dug out of the earth per year. These numbers are kind of possibly quite old now, but when I first researched this slide, this was the number. But on the other hand, only 1,000 carats of synthetic diamonds are produced per year. So that's actually quite a significant amount less. However, if you come across coloured diamonds in the jewellers or whatever, when you're shopping for diamonds, as I'm sure that you do regularly, don't we all? If you do come across coloured diamonds that are at all affordable and not in a museum, it's much more likely they're synthetic than natural, just because the very high quality coloured diamonds that occur naturally are very, very rare. And the difference between synthetic and natural diamonds is at the microscopic level. So you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They are chemically identical, but they'll have different flaws to natural diamonds, which people who are expert in looking at this could detect using a microscope or doing some kind of fluorescence type experiments. So I guess a question we might ask is, are these synthetic diamonds really diamonds, or are they kind of fake diamonds? And is this kind of, does this feed in at all to why not that many of them are made compared to the worldwide market in diamonds that are kind of dug out of the ground? And I guess there is the kind of psychological thing about kind of, if somebody gave you a synthetic diamond that was grown in the lab, is that really the same as a diamond that was like forged in the earth for millennia and has like been erupted to the earth's surface and then produced and then cut and then has been chosen especially for you, versus something that's kind of been grown in a pressure container? Personally, I really wouldn't care, but some people might. But the important thing is that they're not fake. They are actually genuinely chemically identical to real diamonds. And there are fake diamonds, you know, different forms of different minerals and things like that, which are fake diamonds. But in this particular case, these are just synthetic diamonds, but they are chemically identical. So this is a slide that usually when I give this talk to 17 and 18-year-olds, and I've given this talk in front of 900 at a time in Logan Hall in the Institute of Education. And as I start to explain this slide in more and more detail, people become very disruptive. So every single teenager turns to the person next to them and goes, that's really gross. So basically, I'm assuming you're all doing that and I can't hear you. That's really a benefit of doing this. So actually, it turns out you can, well, people say you could turn any carbon-based material into a diamond. And this charming company called LifeGem, I don't know if they still exist, but when I did research, they certainly did exist. They claim that they can create a diamond from the carbon of your loved one. as a memorial to their unique life. This is the dead cat thing that I kind of said in my blurb, that I might throw in the dead cat, because I was kind of saying, would you want to turn your pet into a diamond? But I mean, this is a bit of a gross idea all round, I have to say, but people must go for it. So basically what you do is you package up the carbon of your loved one in whatever form it is, and send it to LifeGem, and they will send you back a diamond that they claim is made from the carbon of your loved one. And they say, you know, it's identical to, molecularly identical to natural diamonds. So, I mean, if they're using the high temperature, high pressure synthesis, I guess it probably is. And they're created individually from your specific carbon source, which is lovely. So the benefit of doing this now online is that I don't now have to spend 3 minutes trying to calm down an audience of hysterical 17-year-olds. So that's kind of good. I can continue. Okay, so you're pretty smart people. So I guess when you look at this kind of phase diagram, you're kind of thinking, well, if diamond is formed at a high temperature and high pressure up here, but we're actually kind of down here somewhere. So graphite should be the stable form of carbon at room temperature. So why does diamond not just turn into graphite? And this is a really good example of the battle in chemistry, if you like, between thermodynamics and kinetics. So diamond is of a higher thermodynamic energy than graphite. So if a reaction takes place, it kind of wants to go downhill. So it's going to go in that direction. So diamond kind of wants to turn into graphite, but there is a huge activation energy associated with it. I mean, you can imagine the energy required to break all of these bonds and then for them all to move around, etc., to make graphite. So even though more energy is given out when the graphite is kind of formed, you would have to put in a huge amount of energy for that process to take place. So what you could say about diamonds, if you were a very romantic person, is that diamonds are forever. They last forever. It's not like they crumble away into graphite. So diamonds are forever. They're a symbol of the love I will have for you for eternity, you know, forged in the earth over millennia. They will never corrupt. They will never fade away. If you're a less romantic person, you might say diamonds are forever. It's true. But that's because diamond is kinetically stable due to the large activation energy required for its conversion into graphite. And I love this picture. This is the bit in the talk actually where I usually give dating advice to the 17-year-olds, which is a bit of a cheek for me considering I am single. But my dating advice is to, men love it when you say this, when they kind of say, oh, here's a ring, I love you. This is to represent the love I have for you for eternity. It's forged in the earth. It represents my love. And you're just like, well, basically it represents a high activation energy, doesn't it? Anyway, I love this picture largely because she's wearing very, very sensible shoes, but she's also wearing pearls. Lovely. Okay, so I've kind of explained there that diamond is metastable, we call it, at room temperature. So metastable means that even though thermodynamically it should change into graphite, the kinetics mean that that's never going to happen. It's never, ever going to happen. So it means that once you have diamond at room temperature, it will remain there, right? It's metastable. So people started to think, well, can we exploit this and find some way of kind of making diamonds under unusual conditions such that because it's more stable than graphite, it will be the form of diamonds that kind of, it will be the form of carbon that is formed. So I'm going to talk about a low pressure, high-ish temperature synthesis of diamond. And this is through chemical vapor deposition, for any of you who've done kind of thin film deposition. So basically what you do is you take a gas phase mixture of methane and hydrogen. And the methane needs to be just about 1%, or it could be a different carbon source. And the hydrogen needs to be 99%. And we do this at a lowish pressure, so less than an atmosphere, so in an evacuated kind of chamber. And the temperature is still quite high, but not as high as in the high temperature synthesis. And it's in a chamber, and we have to give it some energy in some way, usually by a hot filament or sometimes by some microwave discharge. And what happens is that breaks up all of the hydrogen molecules into hydrogen atoms, and it breaks up the methane into methyl radicals. So you end up with this really reactive mixture in your chamber. And also in your chamber, you introduce some kind of suitable surface. And what happens is you start to get carbon species depositing on that surface. And then you've got all of this stuff in the gas phase above it. And the question is, what kinds of carbon deposits on the surface? And actually what happens is it's just like random how it nucleates on the surface, and both sp2 and sp3 type carbons are formed on the surface. So kind of graphitic and diamond are formed simultaneously. But what happens is, because you have so much of this hydrogen atoms, which are really reactive, in the atmosphere above this, they etch away the graphite. So they react with the graphite to give the methane back, but they don't react with the diamonds because of that kinetic limitation. The diamond is so stable that they're not going to react. And so what happens is you're left with just diamond. And the diamond nucleation sites kind of are there, and the graphite is etched away, and you just keep going until you've grown a full layer. So what does this look like? Well, not massively exciting. It has to be said, if you're looking at it just like macroscopically. It kind of looks like this. It looks like grey film. And the reason that it looks kind of grey and quite matte, so it's not shiny and transparent like this gemstone up here, even though it is chemically identical. The reason it looks like this is that it's grown little crystallites of diamond. And because they're so small, the way that the light kind of refracts and reflects and kind of goes through it gives just this kind of grey appearance, which is kind of dull. But if you look at it under the scanning electron microscope, the SEM, what you can see is that in the early stages of growth, so if you took out one of these layers when it hasn't grown much, you can kind of see these little nucleated sites, which are quite clearly like quite faceted, so they're diamonds. And then as you grow the full layer, you can kind of see, you kind of get these crystals growing higgledy-piggledy over each other until they've grown a full layer. So it is kind of like, I would say 99% or 99.9% sp3 bonding, so diamond type bonding. But there are kind of grain boundaries between these, which will have some sp2 type defect sites, so kind of graphitic type sites. And it will depend upon, you know, the growth conditions and how small or big the crystallites are, how much that is. So you may ask, well, why would you want to do that? So this kind of opens up a whole research field. So to a chemist, if you look at its properties, diamonds could be more than a gemstone, or should be more than a gemstone. It's the hardest material known. It has the highest thermal conductivity. So I mentioned right at the start about having that really interesting property that it's cold to the touch. And that's how you can tell the difference between a real diamond and some material that's pretending to be diamond. So if you touch diamonds, it will feel cold. And the reason for that is that that kind of bonding that I showed, that kind of crystal structure, which is like an extended structure that, you know, goes on and on and on, it conducts heat away from your finger really quickly. So if you kind of touch it with your finger, the heat gets conducted down those bonds and kind of away from your finger. So you can imagine that that is a really useful property, for example, in electronics and things like that, where you're producing a lot of heat in a device, but you want to be able to dissipate it, or kind of coatings and that kind of thing, where you want to be able to dissipate heat as well as having a hard coating. It also has really good optical properties, which I've already discussed before, and its transparency. It's a great electrical insulator. It's inert, and related to being inert, it's also biocompatible. So it means that you can kind of think that if you could grow this in a form that was useful, like a film or something like that, you might be able to open up new technological applications. And so in recent years, so I'd have said over the last 2 to 3 decades, there have been more and more applications of diamond thin films that you can now buy commercially. So in the last, I would have said 10 years, 15 years, it's become a commercial kind of venture. So quite often it is just used for coatings, for very hard coatings, to protect surfaces and that kind of thing. But also it's good because it can conduct heat away as well. But there are examples where people have managed to grow it in a way that it's transparent, so you can exploit its optical properties. So you do this by very carefully controlling the growth conditions to avoid getting small crystallites, but to grow whole layers of single crystal diamond. And you do that by introducing your carbon source, then fleshing out the carbon and introducing all of your hydrogen, and then introducing the carbon again, and then the hydrogen, and you kind of grow it layer by layer, basically. It's a very long, drawn out process, but you can then grow diamond, which is really high optical properties. So what I want to highlight here is this example here. So this is from my research, and it's something we did, and it's more than 10 years ago now. So this is an electrode that has been made out of diamond, and I've lost the scale at the bottom, but I think the top here is about 10 microns. So it's a pretty small, sharp electrode that is made out of diamond. So you may ask, well, diamonds, electrodes, didn't I just say that diamond was an excellent insulator? Haven't I just been going on about all of those electrons being taken up in bonding, etc., etc.? Well, yes, diamond in its pure form, undoped, is an excellent insulator. But if you remember earlier, I talked about how you can make diamond blue if it has some boron dopants or impurities in it. And it turns out that if you deliberately grow diamond in the way that I've just described, so growing those diamond layers, the kind of covering a whole surface in diamond with the thin film deposition, if you introduce some boron, a very small amount of boron, into your gas phase mixture, then some boron will incorporate into some of the carbon sites. And what happens is that the boron introduces this empty energy level, as I described earlier. And if you introduce enough boron, this energy level starts to broaden out, like it spreads both up and down. So it eventually touches the valence band down here. And what that does is it means that it introduces a band, an impurity band, which means that this band isn't fully occupied with electrons. And that's kind of what you need for it to be conductive. So it introduces conductivity. And it turns out boron doped diamond, or BDD as we call it, is an excellent electrode material. It has all of the advantages of diamonds in the sense that it's robust and inert. And this is an advantage in many applications, as you can imagine. So especially its biocompatibility, the fact that things don't kind of stick to the surface so much means that it's kind of good for applications like detection of neurotransmitters. It's good at detecting and using for analysis in very complex media, so like biological media, when you might have proteins that stick to the electrode surface. So actually I did my PhD in growth and working out, the properties and potential applications of boron doped diamonds in the early days, when you couldn't buy boron doped diamond electrodes. Then we had to grow them, which was a bit of a black art, but I grew some. But now actually you can buy boron doped diamond. It's commercially available and people use it semi-regularly. It's not like as common as like platinum or glassy carbon or that kind of thing, but it's a fairly well-known electrode material these days. So I've said here the role of surface functional groups is still under investigation. And I'm mentioning this because this is something that I'm kind of interested in. And the reason this is interesting is if you think about what the surface of diamond might be like. So this is the structure of diamond, but as I said before, you've got carbon bonded to 4 other carbons. But if I put the surface here, and this is the surface, then of course this carbon can't be bonded to another carbon because it's the surface, right? So you kind of chop off the bond and you would be left with a single electron here, kind of a dangling bond. And of course, that's not just going to sit there, something is going to happen to it. So you're going to get some restructuring of the surface. And the surface kind of restructures in various ways, depending on the environment. So you're going to get, in some cases, it's going to form a double bond with a neighboring carbon, or it's very likely to react with the atmosphere, so the oxygen that's in the atmosphere. So basically the surface of diamond can quite often be quite complex and have a lot of organic functionalities on the surface like this, which give rise to different properties which might be good or bad. So for example, you've got acid groups here, so there can be pH changes at the surface of the electrode, or these groups are negatively charged, so they may attract positively charged species, which again could be a good thing or a bad thing. So it's kind of interesting to research into that. And one way that we've done that actually is by deliberately looking at structures which are kind of mimicking the defects in the surface functionalities that we might get on these electrodes, but in a controlled way. So this was some research I did in collaboration with Professor Saltzman's group, where he makes these graphene nanoflakes, which are like pure graphene in the center, but the edge groups are all carboxylic acid. And what this enables us to do is to very carefully understand the role of the carboxylic acid groups without having to think about the other groups that are present. And a bit of kind of context of why we might want to do this. So diamond electrodes are still not super commonly used, but carbon electrodes are really ubiquitous. They're like everywhere. Carbon is, you know, the most often used electrode material, and that's because it's readily available, pretty cheap. You can machine it into different forms, produce it in different forms, etc. So some technologies would be supercapacitive and anodes of batteries, and many others. And it's important to kind of try and understand the role of these surface functionalities in these different applications, and if they're good or if they're bad. And that's kind of one of the things that I'm interested in. So to move swiftly on to another form of diamond, so this is a form of diamond called detonation diamond or nano diamond. And that is again kind of playing with this area of the phase diagram, so high temperature, high pressure. And what we're doing is starting at room temperature and, as the name suggests, carrying out an explosion. So what people do is they would take an explosive like TNT, which has got a lot of carbon in it, and they, under controlled conditions, in the absence of oxygen, they will explode it, detonate it. And in the explosion, all kinds of solid carbons are formed, a lot of soot, but a certain percentage of that soot, depending on the conditions, we find as diamond. And specifically, the form of diamond that is formed is something called nano diamond. So what happens is that when they get the soot, they clean it up, they remove all of the other stuff, the graphitic stuff, and you're left with this grey kind of powder. I mean, it looks incredibly boring, right? But this is 100% diamond. So it has the same structure as this one, this gemstone diamond. But you can just buy this from Sigma Aldrich in a pot and just store it in your lab when you've got lab. And what does this look like? Well, if you look at it under the high resolution transmission electron microscope, so the TEM, we find that these particles are relatively monodisperse. So they're all around about 5 nanometers. There's some variation like 2 to 10 nanometers, but they're all going to be around about 5 nanometers. And you can kind of see from the lines through it, that's kind of the crystal structure, so they're the crystal planes. And if people measure the distance between the crystal planes, then you can tell that it's diamond. So it's 100% diamond. So what else do we know about this nano diamond? Well, what we know is that the core is sp3 carbon, but it does have the occasional nitrogen impurity, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, that people try and introduce more nitrogen impurities into this deliberately. And then the outside, you have this kind of shell, and the thickness of this shell kind of depends on how clean the diamond is and how much it's been cleaned up. But it's believed that it's a kind of mixture of sp2 and sp3 type carbons. And the termination, if it's being kind of cleaned up using acids and processed in the usual kind of way, is a lot of oxygen functionalities, basically. I've said C double bond O, but it's actually a range of all kinds of different terminations. So my interest in this kind of came about by accident a few years ago, because initially I kind of thought this nano diamond isn't going to be very interesting to me as an electrochemist because it's not doped. This diamond isn't doped. So it's going to be an insulator. So I've been doing work on boron doped diamond. I'm just like, no, it's not going to give anything. And as the dry powder, it's really very resistive. So yeah, you can't make an electrode out of it. But actually what we did do is we drop coated it onto an electrode from suspension. So we took the powder, suspended it in water, and then dropped a layer of this suspension onto an electrode. We let the water evaporate and you're left with a layer of the nano diamond that adheres to the surface of the electrode. And if we do that, then we can use that electrode and measure the electrochemical response of that nano diamond layer itself. And it turns out that it undergoes oxidation and reduction. So it's kind of interesting that bulk diamonds is an insulator, but this nano diamonds is redox active. It has electrochemistry associated with it. But it's not because the diamond's core itself is conductive. It's all to do with those surface functional groups that I talked about. So we investigated this still further, looking at its redox properties and how it behaved in different kind of redox environments with different redox couples present. And we did some spectroscopy as well. And what we discovered was that it's to do with the surface functional groups that I've talked about. So it's to do with surface functional groups like quinones and hydroquinones, which have redox chemistry that are present on the surface. That means that these nano diamonds, instead of being as inert as you would expect, actually have very interesting and rich surface chemistry, including electrochemistry. And these are a couple of papers from some time ago now, more than 10 years ago. But I'm kind of highlighting this because the name, I've underlined Christoph's name here. So Christoph was an MSci student of mine, actually, and he just happened to be the person who was working on this project at a time when we were being very kind of prolific with results. And so he got a couple of really nice papers out of it. And that's just to kind of show that you guys, that if you're staying on for your MSci, you could get some nice papers. So another place where nano diamonds have been quite kind of hot recently in the last few years, and this still continues to this day even more, is in applications around drug delivery. So it's kind of related to a few of the properties. So one of the properties that it's going to be inert and biocompatible. So you wouldn't expect the diamond particles to be toxic or harmful. And then the other is that it has this large surface area on these nanoparticles, but also these functional groups, which people suggest could be good for absorbing drug molecules on in quite a selective but reversible way. So people are particularly interested in its use in chemotherapy treatments, largely because normally when people are given chemotherapy, they have to be given a large dose of drugs because cells can detect the drugs quite quickly and see them as a poison. So they efflux them. They throw them out of the cell. So it means that you have to take a higher dosage of drug than otherwise you'd want to, and that has harmful side effects. So the hope was that the nano diamonds could go into the cell and they kind of like sneak in the drug, and then the drug kind of gradually gets released in the nano diamonds, and before the cell has a chance to throw the drug out. So this is, I'm not quite up to date with this field, but the last time I went to a conference, this was still like a really big thing. One of the questions though is, does the body ever get rid of the nano diamonds? And that hasn't really been answered. So it's like, it's fine, you've been treated, but your body is now full of diamond dust. Is that a problem? That's still an open question. And I guess the question that I usually ask related to work that I've done is diamond actually inert at the nano scale? Is it as harmless and inert as you think it is? Because I'm not quite sure I want to put something redox active into my cells, but so that's still an open question. And related to this, and putting these nano diamonds into bodies and cells, is that people do a lot of work in developing fluorescent nano diamonds. So the picture here shows a cell, and then here this is the fluorescence microscope image, where the green dots that you can see here are the nano diamond particles that are in the cell, and here's some that have got this kind of bluer fluorescence. And the way that they do this is to deliberately introduce defects into the structure. So they can do this. The most common defect is called an NV defect, which is nitrogen vacancy defect, and it makes the most of the fact that there's a lot of nitrogen already in the structure because it's a common impurity. And there are often vacancies also where carbons are just kind of missing from the lattice structure. And if you can manipulate the structure such that you can put the vacancy next door to a nitrogen, then that gives rise to fluorescence. So people do quite a lot of work on that kind of thing. And related to that, though I know a lot less about it, but these defects also, people want to deliberately introduce them in a very controlled way to use in quantum computing, because they see it as a way of being able to store data in specific locations within the diamond that then you could read out later. So that's, again, a huge active ongoing research field. And then I've got a few examples just towards the end of this talk of other areas that I'm particularly interested in. So I'm interested in the use of nano diamonds in photocatalysis. So I'll be having a Marie Curie fellow who's going to come and work with me in January on this particular topic. And I've also been involved on the scientific advisory board of a big European project looking at this called DIACAT. So in 2013, there was a really interesting paper which built on something that the diamond community knew about already for a long time. And that is that if you look at the electronic structure of diamonds, you have your valence band, a huge band gap, 5.5 eV, and then a conduction band. And it was known that if you terminated your diamond, not with oxygen, but with hydrogen deliberately, it raised the conduction band above the vacuum level, which is shown here. And this is important because what this means is that you could use light, it would have to be UV light, as I've explained right at the start, to excite electrons from the valence band into the conduction band. And because the conduction band is above the vacuum level, it means that there's no barrier for this electron to be ejected from the conduction band straight into the vacuum. And it's this lack of barrier, it's the position of this level above here. And people have known this for a really long time, and we're kind of thinking about how to use this in emitter devices and things like that, but you need the vacuum for it. And this paper in 2013 demonstrated for the first time that actually you can eject these electrons from the conduction band of diamond. So if you shine UV light on diamond, it produces these electrons, and they can be ejected into a solution, not just into vacuum. So you could eject them into water, where they form what are called solvated electrons. And solvated electrons are not very long-lived, but they're incredibly high energy. So they're very reducing. Their reduction potential, so here I've got a reduction potential scale, is really, really negative. So if any of you are kind of in third year and have done my 0037 module, you'll have seen that, you know, I've talked about versus different potentials versus normal hydrogen and that kind of thing. I've usually been talking about stuff up here like plus or minus 1 or something. The solvated electron has a reduction potential down here somewhere, really, really, really negative. And the reason that this is important is that maybe this could reduce something like nitrogen, which is so difficult to reduce, has a really negative potential. And if you could reduce nitrogen to form ammonia in any kind of commercial kind of application, basically the Nobel Prize is yours. You know, Harvard did it like years ago for high temperature, high pressure kind of synthesis. But if you could do it under more benign conditions, I don't expect to see this happen soon. It's not a very efficient process, but it was a very cool thing, and it's something that I'm kind of interested in studying, these solvated electrons and what they can do. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about very quickly diamonds in space, just because it's fun. I know very little about it, but I always think it's really fun to find out about these things. So there's a few places where people talk about diamond being in space, and one is in the center of planets. So where there's like really high pressure, so they will speculate by looking at chemical composition, and then they make real great use of those phase diagrams of carbon that I've been showing to calculate and say, oh, if you went to that planet, which you never would do, and mine to the center of it, you would find a giant diamond. There is stories about diamonds raining in space, or just various kind of diamond space dust and that kind of thing. And also meteorites are found to contain diamonds. So if I talk about briefly this idea of diamond rain, so I did a new search on this, because the last time I talked about this was some years ago, and it keeps coming up again and again. Every time there's a documentary which mentions it, the Daily Express runs a story about there being diamonds rain on Saturn or Neptune or somewhere like that. So basically this is all very theoretical work, where people will look and say, well, there's a methane atmosphere, and so the methane, as it falls or gets compressed by the rest of the atmosphere as it gets closer to the planet, starts off as vapor, gets squashed so it becomes a liquid, and then gradually becomes diamond. So it's really feasible that you could get these diamond gemstones raining down on you in Saturn. But then other people will point out, well, you haven't thought about what the other gases are there and what they're going to do, and whether that's actually going to be there or not. But people love doing this kind of speculation. But what is actually definitely true is that people have detected diamond in meteorites. So you can extract these nano diamonds. It's exactly the same nano diamond that I talked about previously.
Tissues somewhere.
Oh,
right. Thank you. It's all right. I just wondered.
And yeah, so they found that about 3% of the carbon in meteorites is nano diamond. So, I mean, if you extrapolated this, you would think that 1 gram of cosmic dust would contain 10,000 trillion diamonds. So where the hell are all of these diamonds? Well, there are diamonds in space. I don't know if they're actually the source of the ones that are in the meteorites. There's a, you know, the open question as to whether the diamonds in meteorites are kind of formed during the impact, or whether they're already kind of embedded within the meteorites. But there is evidence that there is quite a lot of diamond dust possibly in space, probably of the form of that 5 nanometer nano diamond that I talked about before. So why don't we see all of this all of the time? And it's because largely we haven't looked that much. The reason that people have thought that it is there is that the spectroscopic signature, the infrared signature, has been identified. So I think there are kind of plans to look further, because the interesting thing about it is that if it's in space, then I've already talked about this kind of quite active surface that's available for processing of other molecules on the surface. The stuff could absorb on the surface and then react and then go on to make larger molecules. And a lot of research goes on about how different more complex molecules are formed in space, and these kind of surfaces are interesting to study from that perspective. So that's kind of it from me. I've given you a kind of whirlwind tour really of these different types of diamonds, so from gemstones to the stuff that you just dig out of the ground that's not cut, to the diamond that we can grow as a film and we can possibly use, diamond in space, the nano diamond. So I hope that I've shown that there's more to diamond than just a pretty face, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was such an interesting talk. Really excited for you to win the Nobel Prize, by the way.
It'll happen, don't worry.
And also, the really sad thing about being offline, obviously, is you can't get audience reactions, because I was really laughing at the sensible shoe lady.
Good.
Brilliant dating advice. And as well, I was really interested with the kind of synthetic diamond chat. So that's actually, I think that's because of De Beers. So they're one of the world's like leading owners of the world's natural diamonds. And when this this synthetic diamond happened, they basically like bought loads of stock and slashed the price as a sort of marketing ploy. So everything, you could buy it for like 50 quid and it was just so cheap. Yeah, super cheap. So
yeah, this is, I think, most of the research, I think, into this artificial diamond is done by places like De Beers.
yeah.
They want to know about it, and they want to know straight away how they can detect the difference between the synthetic and the natural diamond. It's interesting because the market really hasn't taken off, but I have heard stories about, you know, companies in China buying all of these high temperature, high pressure synthesis, and that all of a sudden the market's going to be flooded with all of these Chinese gemstones, which De Beers can't control, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, be interesting.
So I think we've got some questions in the chat. Can we try a quick poll? Please react by thumbs up or thumbs down if you own diamonds in jewelry. Yeah, I do, but it's passed down, inherited. Okay.
I'm not really a jewelry person, to be honest. I don't own any jewelry.
So yeah, seems like quite a lot. If you've bought diamonds in jewelry, trying to do a poll. Sorry, Zoe.
Yeah, so this is me trying to do a poll from that historic aspect. Yep, the role possibly has been changing, particularly. You know, you said you've inherited.
Yeah.
My diamond ring I'm wearing is inherited, and now we have sort of zirconia or very good fashion jewelry. You know, you couldn't tell the difference between real diamonds and fake diamonds. You know, does it still have that same value, or are we actually now moving that diamonds is something to be used, as Catherine was talking about, all these different applications? Or would you like to have a diamond ring with your loved one instead of a Victorian style mourning brooch?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, I don't know about how tastes have changed, and I guess people like the access to lots of cheaper jewelry that they can. People less have that kind of one standout piece, that the bit that they always wear, like the lady with the pearls. The only jewelry I have, actually, I do have some pearls that I inherited from my grandma, actually, and I really like them because they're classy, but I don't really have much opportunity to wear them. So.
Yinglu's put not that affordable to students. Lol. Yeah, definitely.
And you know, do people feel it's an important thing now as jewelry, or possibly is it, you know, gold is far, you know, the gold standard and value is because it's can't be transmuted, but yeah, it's got a different view, and I thought that was really interesting of Catherine's comments of how much more use we can make of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's about how. I mean, I remember when I started my PhD, or actually it was my fourth year master's project, and I was given the book about diamonds. It was quite a dry book about applications of thin film diamonds. And it kind of gave the impression in 10 years that all TV flat screens would be made of diamonds and everything would be made of diamonds. And of course, other technologies have immediately overtaken that just so quickly. And so it's used in very niche fields now. It's still a really difficult thing to get a handle on technologically. But companies like Element 6 in the UK, E6, which I think originally was related to De Beers, but is now kind of an independent company, they do make a living, but out of very kind of niche applications. So for example, if anybody's done ATR IR, you have the diamond prism, and that's an example of CVD diamonds rather than thin film diamonds, which has a real application and a useful one.
So we've got a question from Catalina. What do you think about diamonds made from CO2?
Oh, okay. So using CO2 as a carbon source for making the diamonds. Do you know what? That's I'm trying to think if anybody's done this. I think the problem would be the oxygen in the CO2. So if you're growing diamonds, you need to be really careful to exclude oxygen as much as you can, because otherwise you're just going to get lots of oxide species. I mean, the thing with CO2 is it's the reason CO2 is formed is that it's the sink, right? It's the most stable species. So if there's any carbon or oxygen around, it's going to go to CO2. So I'm not quite sure if anybody's done that, but what people are doing is related to that photocatalysis that I talked about at the end. And the project that I was kind of advising on, they were trying to use those solvated electrons from the diamond to reduce CO2, actually, to use CO2 and convert it into other things, which isn't really answering that question, but it was a use of diamond to get rid of CO2. So, yeah.
And we've also got a question from Sarah Wills. Do you have any further info on using diamond for storage in quantum computing? I know nothing about it, but does it have something to do with spin in the empty sites, etc.?
Yes, it has something to do with spin in the empty sites, etc. That's as much as I know about it as well. Yeah, I think it's to do with controlling where that spin is and trying to get that control over. It's not quite the synthesis, because they're made, the nano diamonds certainly are made through this explosion. You have very little control over that, but what they have control over is processing afterwards. So it's usually kind of annealing, or what temperature you heat it at, or irradiation to produce more defects, and it's controlling where those are within the structure, which is what people do. But yeah, it is to do with spin in empty sites. Yeah.
Susan, you had your hand up, but have you put it in the chat?
Oh, it's just that when people say, why do you wear a lot of jewellery? Some of it's real, but some of it's costume. It's so that people can ask, it's chemistry. It's so hard to stick a piece of stone, like not a real diamond, but a zirconia, into metal. It's not an easy feat. And would anybody like to say, please, how they managed to stick the zirconia into the metal? It falls out so easily too. Thank you very much for letting me say.
I mean, I wish I was a jewellery designer. That'd be quite a nice job, actually. Okay, so if there's no more questions for Professor Holt,
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll pass on to Chiara, and she can sort us get us sorted for the breakout rooms and things.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much again for your talk, because I was one of those 17-year-olds who came to see it a while ago. Yeah, so you really are inspiring the next generation of chemists.
It's really nice
Even
to
if
hear.
it's just
Very
me.
nice to hear.
I also want to advertise we have our first lunchtime talk next week at 1 o'clock. So for anyone who can't come to the Tuesday one, it's by Jonathan Nitschke from Cambridge, who works with Callie Haynes in the department on metal organic frameworks, so capsulating molecules for transport. So if you're interested, come along next Wednesday. So now I'll pause the recording. Stop the recording.